Emma stood in the doorway of her small apartment, keys dangling from her fingers as she stared at the man on her doorstep. Jack shifted his weight from one foot to the other, a duffel bag slung over his shoulder and 2 more bags at his feet. "I'm really sorry about this," he said, his voice deeper than she remembered. It had been almost 2 years since she'd last seen him. Emma forced a smile and stepped aside. "Come in, it's starting to rain." She hadn't expected to see her former Stepson again, especially not like this. Her divorce from his father had been final for 18 months, and she'd worked hard to build a new life for herself. Now Jack, at 28, was standing in her living room, looking both embarrassed and grateful. "I promise it's just for a few weeks," he said, setting down his bags carefully. "Just until I can find a new place." Emma nodded, trying not to show her discomfort. "The landlord kicked you out with no notice." "Water damage from the upstairs apartment. They're saying at least 2 months for repairs." Jack ran a hand through his dark hair. "Dad's place is too far from my work, and things are still difficult between you two," Emma finished for him. She knew all about the tensions between Jack and his father. It had been one of many issues in her marriage. "Yeah." He looked around the apartment. It was small, just 1 bedroom, a bathroom, and an open kitchen and living area. "I really appreciate this. I can sleep on the couch." Emma shook her head. "The couch is too small for someone your height. We'll figure something out." Later that evening, after ordering pizza because neither felt like cooking, they sat at her small kitchen table. The silence between them stretched uncomfortably. "So," Emma said finally, "you're still doing graphic design?" Jack nodded, seeming relieved to have something to talk about. "Yeah. I'm working with a small marketing firm now. Better pay, but the hours can be long." "That's good." Emma took a sip of her water. "I'm still at the bookstore. Assistant manager now." "Congratulations." He smiled, and Emma was struck by how much his smile reminded her of happier times, before everything fell apart with his father. That night, Emma made up the pull-out sofa bed and brought out extra blankets. They worked together to move the coffee table and make enough space. "It's not much," she said. "It's perfect, thanks." Jack tested the mattress with one hand. "Better than my friend's floor, which was my other option." Emma retreated to her bedroom and closed the door, leaning against it with a sigh. How strange life was. 5 years ago, she had been married to Robert, living in a nice house, and Jack had been the somewhat distant Stepson who visited on weekends. Now she was divorced, living in a tiny apartment, and sharing that tiny space with the same Stepson. She changed into her pajamas and crawled into bed, listening to the sounds of Jack moving around in her living room. The apartment walls were thin, and she could hear water running in the bathroom, then footsteps, and finally the creak of the sofa bed. Emma stared at the ceiling. Just a few weeks, she told herself. They could manage that without it being too awkward. They were adults. She was 36, not that much older than him really. They could be friends, roommates. What exactly was the relationship between an ex-stepmother and her adult former stepson? She turned onto her side and pulled the blanket higher. Tomorrow she would buy earplugs and maybe a room divider, something to create more space in an apartment that suddenly felt much too small. As she drifted off to sleep, Emma couldn't shake the feeling that these few weeks were going to change things in ways she couldn't yet imagine. A week passed, and Emma was surprised by how quickly they fell into a routine. Jack woke early, quiet as he could be, though Emma usually heard him anyway. He would make coffee for both of them before heading to work. By the time Emma got home in the evening, Jack had usually picked up something for dinner or started cooking. "I didn't know you could cook," Emma said one night as she watched him stir a pot of pasta sauce. Jack shrugged. "Had to learn after college. Dad never taught me, so I watched videos online." Emma leaned against the counter. "Your father could barely make toast." They both laughed, and Emma felt something loosen in her chest. Maybe this arrangement wouldn't be so bad after all. On Saturday morning, Emma woke to the smell of pancakes. She pulled on her robe and found Jack in the kitchen, flipping a perfect golden circle onto a plate. "Morning," he said, sliding the plate toward her. "Hope you still like blueberries in yours." Emma stared at the pancakes, touched that he remembered. "You didn't have to do this." "Wanted to. You're letting me stay here, it's the least I can do." His smile was warm. different from the awkward one he'd worn when he first arrived. After breakfast, Emma mentioned she needed to go to the hardware store. The kitchen sink is leaking again. I can fix that, Jack offered. Just need a wrench and maybe some plumber's tape. Emma raised her eyebrows. Really? Since when are you handy around the house? Since I couldn't afford to call someone every time something broke, he grinned. I'm full of surprises. Later, as she watched him work under the sink, Emma realized how little she really knew about him. During her marriage, Jack had been mostly his father's son, visiting every other weekend, polite but distant with her. Now she was seeing a whole different side of him. Hand me that towel? Jack asked, his voice echoing slightly under the sink. Their fingers brushed as she passed it to him, and Emma felt an unexpected tingle run up her arm. She pulled back quickly, confused by her reaction. That evening, they sat on opposite ends of the couch watching a movie. Emma found herself watching Jack instead, noticing the way his eyes crinkled when he laughed, how he absently ran his hand through his hair when he was thinking. What? He asked, catching her staring. Nothing, Emma said quickly. Just thinking how different you are from when I was married to your dad. Jack turned to face her fully. I was just a kid then, really, 23 and thinking I knew everything. And now? Now I know I don't know anything, he laughed. But I'm figuring it out. They talked late into the night. Jack told her about his dreams of starting his own design company someday. Emma shared her secret wish to open a small bookstore cafe. You'd be great at that, Jack said, his eyes bright with genuine interest. You always knew exactly which books to recommend. Emma smiled, surprised he remembered that too. You read that fantasy series I suggested, all 12 books. Best recommendation ever. Jack's smile faded slightly. Dad always thought reading was a waste of time. Your father and I didn't agree on many things, Emma said softly. That was just one of them. A comfortable silence fell between them. It was strange, Emma thought, how easy it was to talk to Jack now. No awkwardness, no careful dancing around topics related to her failed marriage. When Emma finally went to bed that night, she found herself looking forward to tomorrow. For the first time since Jack had arrived, she didn't think about how small the apartment was or when he would leave. Instead, she wondered what other surprises she might discover about the man sleeping just on the other side of her bedroom wall. And that thought made her both nervous and oddly excited. 3 weeks into their living arrangement, Emma had a terrible day at work. A customer had yelled at her over a special order that hadn't arrived, and her boss had blamed her even though it wasn't her fault. She trudged up the stairs to her apartment, shoulders heavy with stress and a pounding headache making her temples throb. When she opened the door, the smell hit her first. Something rich and savory that made her stomach growl despite her mood. The lights were dimmed and soft music played from Jack's wireless speaker. Bad day? Jack asked, looking up from the kitchen counter where he was stirring something in a pot. Emma dropped her bag and kicked off her shoes. How could you tell? You texted that your boss was being a jerk. Jack smiled sympathetically. I figured you could use a good meal and maybe a glass of wine. Emma felt something warm bloom in her chest, touched by his thoughtfulness. You're cooking for me? Beef stew. My one impressive dish. He grabbed a bottle of red wine from the counter and poured her a glass. Here, sit down and tell me about it. 2 hours and most of the wine bottle later, they sat on the couch, dinner plates empty on the coffee table. Emma had told him everything about her awful day, and Jack had listened, really listened, offering sympathy without trying to fix everything. You know what the worst part is? Emma said, her words slightly fuzzy from the wine. I've been at that store 5 years and I still get treated like I'm new. Jack shook his head. They don't appreciate you. You should open that bookstore you talked about. That's just a dream, Emma sighed but smiled at his support. It doesn't have to be. Jack turned to face her, his knee brushing against hers on the couch. You're smart, you know books, and you're great with people. You'd be amazing. Emma looked at him, really looked at him in the soft lamplight. When had Jack become so grown up, so confident? When had his eyes become so kind and understanding? She'd always thought he was handsome in an objective way, but now, sitting close to him, she felt a flutter in her stomach that had nothing to do with the wine. You really believe that? She asked softly. I believe in you, Jack said, his voice dropping lower. I always have. Emma wasn't sure who moved first. Maybe they both did. Suddenly they were closer, the space between them electric. Jack's hand gently brushed a strand of hair from her face, and his touch sent a shiver through her. Their eyes met, and Emma saw her own confusion and longing reflected in his gaze. This was Jack, her former Stepson. This was wrong, wasn't it? But it didn't feel wrong. It felt like the most natural thing in the world as they leaned toward each other. Their lips were just inches apart when the sharp ring of Emma's phone shattered the moment. They jumped apart as if burned, the spell broken. Emma grabbed her phone from the coffee table, her hands shaking slightly. "It's work," she said, not looking at Jack as she answered. The call was brief. Just her boss asking if she could open the store tomorrow since another employee had called in sick. Emma agreed automatically, her mind still reeling from what had almost happened. When she hung up, the comfortable atmosphere from earlier was gone. Jack stood and began clearing the dishes, his back to her. "Jack," Emma started, not sure what she was going to say. "It's fine," he said quickly, still not looking at her. "We had wine. It was nothing." But they both knew it wasn't nothing. Something had shifted between them, opening a door neither had known existed. "I should get to bed," Emma said finally. "Early morning tomorrow." Jack nodded, relief and disappointment warring in his expression. "Good night, Emma." In her bedroom, Emma changed into her pajamas and sat on the edge of her bed, fingers pressed to her lips as if she could feel the kiss that never happened. What was she doing? This was Jack. There were 100 reasons why what almost happened would be a terrible idea. But as she lay in the darkness, Emma couldn't help wondering what would have happened if that phone hadn't rung. The next few days felt like a careful dance. Emma left for work early and came home late. Jack suddenly had a big project that kept him at the office until after dinner. When they did see each other, their conversations were polite but brief. The easy comfort they had found was replaced by an awkward tension that filled the small apartment. On Thursday night, Emma's phone buzzed with a text message. She picked it up and froze when she saw the name on the screen. "Robert," she muttered. Jack's father hardly ever contacted her since the divorce. She opened the message. "I'll be in town next weekend. Want to see Jack? Is he still staying with you?" Emma stared at the phone, her stomach tight with sudden anxiety. She hadn't told Robert that Jack was living with her. Neither of them had. Jack walked into the living room and noticed her expression. "What's wrong?" "Your father just texted me." Emma held up the phone. "He's coming to town next weekend and wants to see you." Jack's face hardened. "Great, just what we need right now." Emma put the phone down. "We haven't done anything wrong, Jack, haven't we?" Jack ran a hand through his hair, a gesture Emma now recognized as a sign of stress. "We almost kissed, Emma. You were married to my dad for 5 years. And we've been divorced for almost 2, Emma said. "We're both adults. We're not related by blood." They stared at each other, the words hanging in the air between them. It was the first time either had openly acknowledged what had almost happened that night. "What are we doing here?" Jack asked quietly. Emma didn't have an answer. Instead, she picked up her phone again. "What should I tell him?" "The truth, I guess. That I'm staying here temporarily because of my apartment." Jack shrugged. "No need to mention anything else." Emma nodded and typed a reply. When she was done, she looked up to find Jack putting on his jacket. "Where are you going?" she asked. "Meeting some friends for drinks." He didn't look at her. "Don't wait up." After Jack left, Emma tried to focus on a book, but the words blurred on the page. She kept thinking about Robert's upcoming visit and what it might mean for this strange new tension between her and Jack. Later that night, Emma woke to the sound of the front door opening. She glanced at the clock. 1:24 a.m. She heard Jack moving around in the living room, then the bathroom door closing. She should go back to sleep. That would be the smart thing to do. Instead, Emma got up and pulled on her robe. Jack was sitting on the edge of the sofa bed when she came out, still fully dressed except for his shoes. "Did I wake you?" he asked, his voice slightly rough. Emma shook her head. "I wasn't really sleeping." She sat down next to him, careful to leave space between them. "We need to talk about this, Jack." "What's there to talk about?" Jack sighed. "This whole situation is complicated enough without adding, whatever this is." "And what is this?" Emma asked softly. Jack looked at her then, his eyes serious in the dim light from the street lamps filtering through the curtains. "I don't know. All I know is that when I'm with you, I don't think about you as my dad's ex-wife. I just see you as Emma, smart, funny, kind Emma, who loves books and makes terrible coffee and hums when she washes dishes. Emma felt her heart speed up. Jack. And now my dad is coming and he'll look at us and somehow just know, and everything will blow up, and I don't want to hurt you, Emma. I don't want to make your life more difficult than I already have. You haven't made my life difficult, Emma said. Actually, it's been nice having you here. Jack gave a sad smile. Nice enough to risk having everyone in our lives judge us, to risk having my father hate both of us. Emma didn't have an answer for that. The weight of reality settled between them. All the complications, all the reasons why whatever was growing between them should be stopped before it truly began. We should get some sleep, Emma said finally. We can figure this out tomorrow. But as she returned to her room, Emma knew there was no easy answer waiting for them in the morning. The weekend arrived with dark clouds and the promise of a storm. Emma stood by the window, watching as rain began to patter against the glass. Jack had gone out early, mumbling something about meeting a client, though Emma suspected he was still avoiding her. She made herself a cup of tea and curled up on the couch with a book, but couldn't focus on the words. In just a week, Robert would be here, and they still hadn't figured out what to do about these feelings between them. The apartment door opened and Jack rushed in, his hair and jacket wet from the sudden downpour. It's really coming down out there, he said, shaking water from his hair. Emma smiled despite herself. There are towels in the bathroom. As Jack disappeared to dry off, the lights flickered once, twice, and then went out completely. The apartment fell into gray darkness, the only light coming from the storm-darkened windows. Power's out, Jack called from the bathroom. I noticed, Emma replied. I think I have some candles in the kitchen drawer. She fumbled her way through the apartment, hands stretched out in front of her until she reached the kitchen. She was searching through a drawer when she felt Jack's presence behind her. Here, let me help, he said, his voice close to her ear. Their hands bumped in the drawer, and Emma felt that now familiar flutter in her chest. She pulled out a few candles and a box of matches. Hold these, she said, placing the candles in his hands. They moved around the apartment, setting up candles on the coffee table, the kitchen counter, and the small dining table. The soft, flickering light created a warm glow that made the apartment feel smaller, more intimate. Thunder rumbled outside as they sat on the couch, a respectable distance between them. So, Emma said finally, are we going to keep avoiding each other until your father arrives? Jack sighed, his face half in shadow, half illuminated by candlelight. I don't know what to do, Emma. Me neither, she admitted. But I know that pretending nothing's happening isn't working. What is happening? Jack asked, turning to face her. We almost kissed. That's all. Emma looked at him steadily. Is that all it is for you? Just a moment of weakness, a mistake we almost made. Jack was quiet for a long moment, the rain beating against the windows filling the silence. No, he said finally, it's not just that. Then what is it? Emma pressed. I've always thought you were amazing, Jack said, the words coming slowly as if he was just realizing them himself. Even before, when you were with my dad. I was just a kid then, really, but I remember thinking he didn't deserve you. The way he treated you, I hated it. Emma felt a lump form in her throat. Jack. Let me finish, he said, his voice stronger now. When I saw you again that first day, standing in the doorway of this apartment, all I could think was how beautiful you looked. Not as my father's wife, not as my former stepmother, but as a woman I wanted to know better. The candlelight flickered across his face, highlighting the earnestness in his eyes. I've spent weeks trying to convince myself that this is wrong, he continued. That I shouldn't feel this way about you, but the truth is, I don't see you as my stepmother, Emma. I never really did. Our connection now has nothing to do with my father. Emma's heart pounded in her chest. People would judge us. I know. Your father would be furious. I know that too. So what are we going to do about it? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jack moved closer to her on the couch, the space between them shrinking. I think, he said slowly, that we have to decide if what we might have together is worth dealing with all of that. Outside, lightning flashed, briefly illuminating the apartment in stark white light. When the darkness returned, Emma found that Jack was even closer, close enough that she could feel the warmth of his breath. What do you think? He asked softly. Is it worth it? Emma looked into his eyes, seeing all the possibilities of what could be, all the difficulties they would face, And in that moment, with the storm raging outside and the candlelight dancing around them, she made her decision. Yes, Emma whispered, closing the distance between them. I think it's worth it. Their lips met in the darkness, tentative at first, then with growing certainty. Emma felt as if something long dormant inside her had suddenly awakened. Jack's hands cradled her face gently, as if she might break or disappear. When they finally pulled apart, they were both breathless. Jack rested his forehead against hers, his eyes closed. I've wanted to do that for weeks, he admitted. Emma smiled, her fingers tracing the line of his jaw. Me too. The lights flickered back on suddenly, making them both blink in the brightness. The spell of the candlelit darkness wasn't broken though. If anything, seeing each other clearly only strengthened the connection between them. So what happens now? Jack asked, taking her hand in his. Now we figure this out, Emma said, together. The week passed in a blur of stolen kisses and late-night conversations. They talked about everything, their fears, their hopes, what the future might look like. Emma had never felt so understood, so accepted. Jack listened to her dreams of opening a bookstore with genuine interest, offering suggestions and encouragement. But as Saturday approached, the day Robert was coming to town, their happiness was shadowed by anxiety. He's meeting us for lunch at that Italian place downtown, Jack said on Friday night as they sat at the kitchen table. We don't have to tell him anything. Emma nodded, but her stomach twisted with unease. It feels dishonest. It's not dishonest to keep our relationship private until we're ready to share it, Jack reasoned. We're still figuring this out ourselves. Emma wasn't convinced, but she agreed that a busy restaurant wasn't the place for such a conversation. Saturday arrived too quickly. Emma stood in front of her closet, trying to decide what to wear. Everything seemed either too casual or too formal. She finally settled on a simple blue dress that Jack had once complimented. You look beautiful, Jack said when she emerged from her bedroom. Emma managed a nervous smile. I feel like I'm going to be sick. Jack took her hands in his. It's just lunch. We can do this. But lunch was worse than either of them had imagined. Robert arrived late, full of stories about his new life, his new girlfriend, his new success. He barely asked Jack about his work, and when he did, he dismissed Jack's accomplishments with backhanded compliments. Graphic design still? Well, I guess if it pays the bills. Robert shrugged, cutting into his steak. Emma felt anger rising in her chest at the familiar dismissive tone. She glanced at Jack and saw the tightness around his mouth, the way he carefully controlled his expression. Actually, Jack just landed a huge client, Emma said. They specifically sought him out because of his talent. Robert looked between them, his eyes narrowing slightly. Well, aren't you too cozy? How long have you been staying with Emma now, Jack? About a month, Jack answered. My apartment should be ready in another few weeks. Robert took a sip of his wine. And how is that working out, sharing such a small space? There was something in his tone that made Emma tense, a knowing edge that scraped against her nerves. It's been fine, she said evenly. We're both adults. Yes, you are. Robert's gaze was sharp, assessing. You know, my colleague Tom saw you two at that wine bar on Maple Street last week. Said you looked very friendly. Jack's hand stilled on his water glass. Dad, how long has this been going on? Robert asked, his voice deceptively calm. How long have you been sleeping with my son, Emma? The restaurant seemed to go silent around them. Though logically Emma knew the other diners couldn't have heard, she felt her face flush with anger and embarrassment. That's not what's happening, Jack said firmly. Robert laughed bitterly. No. The way you look at her tells a different story. Even if it was, Emma said, finding her voice, it wouldn't be any of your business, Robert. We're divorced. Jack is an adult. Robert's face darkened with anger. So you admit it. I'm not admitting anything, Emma said. I'm telling you that you don't get to control our lives. Robert turned to Jack. I expected better from you. If you continue this, whatever it is, don't expect any more help from me. Not with your career, not with money, nothing. Jack stared at his father for a long moment, his jaw tight. Then, without a word, he stood up, threw his napkin on the table, and walked out of the restaurant. Jack. Emma called after him, but he didn't turn back. Robert shook his head. He'll come to his senses. No, Emma said, gathering her purse. You've never understood him, not at all. She stood up. leaving money on the table for her meal. And you never understood me either. She found Jack outside, pacing on the sidewalk, his hands shoved deep in his pockets. His face was tight with anger and hurt. I'm sorry, Emma said, touching his arm gently. Jack shook his head. Don't apologize for him, never for him. He looked at her, his eyes softening. Are you okay? I should be asking you that, Emma said. He threatened to cut you off. Jack laughed, but there was no humor in it. That's nothing new. He's been using money to control me my whole life. He ran a hand through his hair. But this time, I don't care. They walked home in silence, both lost in their own thoughts. When they reached the apartment, Jack stopped at the door. I think I need some time alone, he said. I'm going to go for a walk. Emma nodded, understanding. I'll be here when you get back. But Jack didn't come back that night. He texted her late, saying he was staying with a friend, that he needed to think. Emma barely slept, her mind racing with worry and doubt. A week passed. Jack returned to the apartment to get his things, saying he thought it would be better if he stayed with his friend until his own apartment was ready. Emma didn't argue, though her heart felt hollow in her chest. Is this it then? She asked as he packed his duffel bag. We try once, face one obstacle, and give up. Jack's movements slowed. I thought this was what you wanted, after what my father said. What I want, Emma said carefully, is for you to make your own decisions, not based on what your father wants and not based on what you think I want. Jack sat down on the sofa bed, the same place where they had first kissed. I don't know what I want, he admitted. All I know is that when I'm with you, I feel more like myself than I ever have. But I also know how hard this would be. Yes, Emma agreed. It would be hard. People would talk. Your father would be angry. Maybe some of our friends wouldn't understand. So then why try? Jack asked, his voice low. Emma sat beside him, close but not touching, because some things are worth fighting for. They were quiet for a long time, the only sound the muffled noise of traffic from the street below. I got a job offer, Jack said suddenly. In Boston, a design firm there saw my portfolio. Emma felt her heart sink. That's great. I was thinking, Jack continued, looking at her now, that Boston has lots of bookstores, but maybe room for one more. Emma's eyes widened as she understood what he was saying. We could start over, Jack said, somewhere new, where no one knows us as anything but Jack and Emma. You want me to come with you? Emma asked, barely breathing. Only if you want to, Jack said. I'm not asking you to give up your life here. I'm just saying, maybe we could build a new one. Together. 1 year later, Emma stood in the center of her small bookstore cafe, watching as Jack hung a framed poster, his design for their grand opening. The bell above the door jingled, and Robert walked in, looking older somehow, more subdued. Nice place, he said, looking around. Jack's designs. Emma nodded, bracing herself, but Robert just sighed. He always was talented, he admitted. I should have seen that sooner. Emma watched as Robert walked over to Jack, their conversation too quiet for her to hear. But she saw the tentative smile on Jack's face, the careful nod from his father. Later that night, at their apartment above the bookstore, Jack pulled Emma close on their couch. He's trying, Jack said. It's something. Emma nodded against his chest. It's a start. Are you happy? Jack asked, his voice quiet in the dim light of their living room. With all of this, with us? Emma looked up at him, at the face that had become as familiar to her as her own. Yes, she said simply. I'm happy. Outside, snow began to fall, dusting the streets of their new city, their new life. Emma thought about how strange the path had been, from a reluctant roommate agreement to this deep, certain love. None of it had been easy, but all of it had been worth it. I'm happy too, Jack whispered and pulled her closer as the snow continued to fall.